How do we go from something that looks like this to something that sounds like this? If you're new to jazz, you may have come across the Real Book. This is a compilation of hundreds of jazz standards, and they're all presented as lead sheets. That is, melody with the chords written above. You may have also discovered that simply understanding chord notation and knowing how to read sheet music does not add up to playing songs well from the Real Book. And that's kind of the point. This format leaves a lot of room for improvisation and arranging. You can use the same lead sheet and play a song with a band, or when you're alone at the piano. Let's focus on that second scenario, where you're playing alone at the piano. I want to give you my best arranging advice for beginners. We'll frame it in terms of 3 questions you can ask about any specific piece of music, so that by the end of this video, you can create your own arrangement for your favorite song in the Real Book. Question 1, how active is the melody? To understand what I mean, let's compare 2 classic jazz standards. There's the one I played at the beginning of the video, Bewitched, and so on. And then another favorite, All the Things You Are. A simple way to describe the difference between those 2 arrangements I played is that in one, the left hand played the chords. In the other, the right hand played the chords. And whether or not one or the other of these approaches is easier for a beginner really depends on the song. With All the Things You Are, the melody is relatively static. We still have some of these other rhythms aside from whole notes, but for the most part, the melody starts on a given note and then stays there for the rest of the sound of the chord. You can see how that makes it relatively practical for me to put all those chord tones in my right hand. And when I was first introduced to this song, All the Things You Are, my teacher asked me to take this exact approach. I was just going to play bass in my left hand and then look for inversions of the chords in my right hand that would leave the melody on top of the chord. Now, meanwhile, with Bewitched, it would be really hard to take this approach with the melody. With a melody this active, you can play it that way, but it becomes something more like block chords like maybe George Shearing or Oscar Peterson would play. It's a lot more difficult to make the melody sound connected and musical. So typically, when I approach a song that has this kind of more active melody, I'm giving more of the chord playing responsibility to my left hand. So for beginners who are just getting started, it can simplify things to start with just one hand in the chord playing role. If it's an active melody, you're going to give the chords to your left hand. If it's a more static melody, you might give the chord tones to your right hand and just let your left hand play bass notes. For the rest of this video, I'll focus more on the left hand chord approach because I want to look at this example song, Bewitched. And already we can get to a pretty good arrangement of the song if we just play root position chords in our left hand. Now, it's possible that even this most basic approach doesn't feel beginner to you. It might feel pretty advanced if you're not used to reading chord notation, and especially this kind of more advanced 7th chords, 6th chords, diminished chords. In that situation, I advise adult students to take a step back and spend more time playing chord notation that uses slightly simpler chords, like triads. That was my experience. I started by playing in middle school band, where we were reading chord charts, we were reading chord notation, but a lot of the chord symbols were more like triads, and the songs were just a little bit easier. So if you're interested in taking that more incremental, step-by-step approach, that is exactly the approach behind my online course that's part of the Piano Fluency membership. So if you're curious about that, you should go to pianofluency.com. I'll leave a link for you to check it out. This kind of step-by-step progression in skill is closely based on what I developed over years of working with adult private students. Even people who would approach me wanting to learn jazz, I would often start them out on these more foundational skills, learning to play triads, learning to get really familiar with key signatures. So the Piano Fluency membership is the closest thing to taking private lessons with me that I can give to people finding me online, but it's a fraction of the cost. And we've got over 100 people in there at this point, working through the course, posting about their progress on the forum, and I'm really enjoying working with all of these people I meet through YouTube. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, head to pianofluency.com to learn more about becoming a member. We're ready for question 2. Where are things getting muddy? For this, let's listen to the end of this first part of Bewitched. You can hear that some of those root position chords in the left hand are starting to get really dense and muddy. And that'll typically happen if you play root position 7th chords in this part of the piano. So, really anytime the bass note of the chord is getting below this C, an octave below middle C, depending on the context, these chords can start to sound a little muddy. So I'm going to give you a few different tools you can use to address this problem. And this is where you can see that arranging is kind of like musical problem solving. It's going to be different for every song, and you make these arranging decisions to kind of steer your arrangement of the piece in the musical direction you want. Our first option is just to move everything up an octave. And it's so simple, but it can have a huge impact on how a piece of music sounds. So I'm going to start by just moving my right hand up an octave to make room, and then most of the left hand will stay where it was. But then here, I have room to go up for the G7 and the A7 chords. That's a very good option. And there are some pieces of music where, especially where the melody is written in the real book, your right hand will be so low that it's very difficult to play this root position left-hand chord approach without moving things up an octave. So that's the first place to look. Try it that way and see if you like how it sounds. Our next tool is to remove voices from the chord. And the first voice you should remove is the 5th of the chord most of the time. That has a relatively neutral sound in most of these 7th chords. So we can play 1, 3, and 7 in the chord and still get most of the characteristic sound of a C major 7 chord. And the same goes for this G dominant 7 and A dominant 7 that were giving us trouble sounding muddy. So here's how the whole thing sounds if I leave out the 5th of every 7th chord. I like this approach a lot. Some of those transitions between chords were still pretty jumpy. We're not necessarily using the greatest voice leading, but for now, in this more beginner version of things, I might even say this is easier than playing root position chords. You've cut out one of the notes, it's a little easier to play, and sometimes we call these shell voicings in jazz piano. So you're just leaving out the 5th of the chord. Another even simpler option is to only play 1 and 3 or 1 and 7. And this is an approach that a lot of bebop pianists will take. So you could play it like this. So there I have only 2 notes in the chord in my left hand. That was 1 and 7 most of the time. I ended up going to 1 and 5 at one point. Here it is with 1 and 3. And you can hear, just instinctively, I sped up the tempo. That's because a lot of the times when we take this approach, only 2 notes in the left hand, we're doing that at faster tempos. It can be a really nice way to lighten things up in the left hand if we're playing a faster piece of jazz music. Our last and most advanced tool for helping out in the places where things get muddy with those root position chords is to change the octave of one of the voices. A lot of times you might need your right hand to help with this. So for example, if we go to this part, right? I've gone down to just 3 voices in the left hand, 1, 3, and 7, but it still is sounding kind of muddy to me. I'm going to take the third of the chord and move it up an octave. This is the most common way that we'll displace a voice in this 1-3-7 shell voicing. We'll flip the third up an octave, so now we have 1, 7, 3. And if you have big hands, you might be able to do this all with your left hand. I can just barely reach this, and I cannot do it on the A dominant 7. More people are probably going to do well taking over with the right hand. And it kind of opens a bigger can of worms, more advanced arranging techniques where you're spreading out the voices more evenly between the hands. But we're sticking to beginner approaches here. So this is the hardest thing I'm going to ask you to do in the video. Just try helping out with your right hand thumb on the G7 and the A7 chord. So we have G7, A7, and there now I'm combining playing the melody on my top note in the right hand and chord tone in the bottom. And then here I'm just going to take back over with the left hand. In context, so that's more difficult than the other tools that we've used so far, but that is my favorite of the arrangements we've arrived at so far. And we're starting to get better voice leading, which leads us to question 3. Where can I improve voice leading? We just saw one example of that. I want to give you an easier one, an even easier one. If you're using this shell voicing approach, where most of your voicings in the left hand are 1, 3, and 7, and you're just leaving out the 5th, a lot of times it works really well to alternate between that voicing and what's more or less an inversion of that voicing. This especially works well when we're going around the circle of fifths, counterclockwise around the circle of fifths, which is what's happening when we go from the D minor 7 to the G dominant 7. This is our famous 2-5 chord progression in jazz. And what I'm doing is going from 1-3-7 to 5-7-3. Here's how it sounds in context. It's so simple. I only had to change one note to go from the D minor 7 to the G dominant 7 chord. So alternating between 1-3-7 and 5-7-3 is something I do all the time when I'm playing this kind of 3-note voicing in my left hand. And it does actually officially put that second chord in an inversion. We're no longer hearing the bass note of the chord on the bottom. But a lot of times that's totally fine. It'll still sound like the song. It'll sound like the chord progression. And it makes your voice leading a lot better in the left hand while still keeping things easy to play. So in my arrangement, I'm going to go from 1-3-7 to 5-7-3 on the G dominant 7 chord, and then stay on that voicing 5-7-3 for the A dominant 7 chord before going back to 1-3-7 on this D minor 7 chord. Here's how that sounds in context. That's starting to be pretty nice voice leading, if I don't say so myself. All right, at this point, I just want to give you a couple other bonus things that I did in my demonstration at the beginning of the video. And these are things that you can apply all over the place in other standards in the real book. Bonus idea number 1 is very simple. You can probably identify what's happening if I just play it for you. That's right, I'm playing octaves in my right hand. This comes up all over the place in solo piano arrangements. It's going to take a little bit of practice to be able to connect melodies that you're playing in octaves, but it's a really nice way to give this kind of lift to the sound of the melody in the right hand. And it works really well for this approach where your left hand is completely in charge of the chord tones, your right hand's playing melody. And finally, this thing that I played at the end. It sounds like this. Now, I rarely spoon feed things to my students, but this is one where I actually was spoon fed this myself by my jazz teacher in high school, an amazing jazz pianist in Portland named Randy Porter. So I'm going to pass that on to you. Basically, what we're doing is we're just improvising this melodic fill here. It sounds like this. So we're more or less outlining a D minor 9 chord. And we go E, D, C, A, F, D, E, D, G. The left hand is going to take that melody, and the right hand is going to harmonize all of it with the chord tones from a D minor 9 chord. So the right hand is basically doing what we were talking about at the start of the video with that other approach to playing a song, where your right hand handles all the chord tones and you're playing an inversion of the chord that puts the melody note on top. We're doing that here in the right hand. The top note in my right hand is the same as the melody in my left, but I'm filling in chord tones beneath it. And the last chord that I played is this. And I'm not going to go too deep into the theory because this video is already getting long. It basically looks like octave G with an E major triad in the middle. And I love this voicing for a dominant 7 chord on the 5. And we're on the 5 chord in the key of C major. So the whole lick is. And with that, we've covered everything that I played at the top of the video. So I hope you can see why arranging is one of my favorite things to do in music. It's like a fun musical puzzle. And remember that it's just the first step. You might arrive at the exact arrangement that you want to play for one of the songs in the real book and still feel like it's not exactly what you imagine in your head. Sometimes that just has to do with these other musical qualities that you might be more familiar with if you're coming from classical music. Dynamics, articulation, the rhythmic phrasing of the melody. And my suggestion there is to sit with the same arrangement of a piece for a while after you've done this first arranging voice leading work, so that you can become more comfortable with it physically, and some of those other musical qualities that you want to hear can find their way into your physical expression on the piano. And with that, I hope you have a lot of fun playing around with the lead sheets in your real book. If you'd like to watch other videos that I have on the topic of jazz and improvisation, I'll leave some links for those here. And if you'd like to work with me more directly and move through that step-by-step progression in piano skill that I described in the Piano Fluency membership, I hope to see you there. My name is Ted with Piano Fluency.